Hello, everyone. Welcome back to AND 492. We're down here on Friday of week 5. We are going to finish our discussion of materialism today with talking about Marvin Harris, one of the, especially after Margaret Mead died, probably the most public of the anthropologists in kind of the late 20th century, always on talk shows and selling books in the airport bookstore and stuff like that. Real popular kind of author especially for an anthropologist. So we'll talk about them today. This week you got summary number 4, discussion board number 5, and quiz number 4, all about materialism. Next week, looking ahead, on Monday, there is no class. Don't forget, please don't come here. It'll all be locked up. It's President's Day. Enjoy your 3-day weekend. On Wednesday, Jose will be in to give a review over test number 1, which is on Friday. I won't be here on Friday. The test is online, so we're not going to take like a sitting in a room kind of test. But you're welcome to take it in the library or the computer lab or wherever, really. It's 8 questions or 9 questions, essay questions, which are not completely, but largely based on the quizzes. So if you're done the quizzes and you feel pretty comfortable with those questions and you've read the articles, especially, I think you should do fine. One of the biggest differences, though, between test and quizzes is that on the test, you've heard me talk about it too, so you've got a little bit more context. But I'll tell you, it's kind of right now. What we're looking for is to see that you've actually read the stuff, right? If I ask you what superior wharf hypothesis and give examples, don't just be like culture and language are real important, right? Tell me specifically, if you got quotes from Wharf, please use those. Or if we're talking about Margaret Mead and culture and personality, use actual quotes from the text. Because this isn't like a sit down and put away all your materials kind of test. I want to see what you know. I want to see that you actually read stuff. I want to see that you're citing things and that you paid attention, right? So, and because it's really short too, real short answers aren't going to cut it when you turn it in. I've also posted a review guide. So this weekend, Jose is going to make a video review, which I'll post to Canvas hopefully by Monday is what I'm shooting for. Just whenever he sends it to me, I'll post it. And then on Wednesday, he'll be in here as well. Basically, he's going to read you the questions and y'all can talk about them, right? You can work through the questions together, and then hopefully you'll all get perfect scores. 8 essays. I said at least 5 or 6, but I mean, you can write plenty, especially if you're quoting people or citing people. I'm pretty sure there's no time limit on this. Let me check that real quick. Why do you? Yeah, there's no time limit. So don't feel rushed. Don't feel like you gotta oh, I'm running out of time. That's why I didn't write any quotes, is because I was running out of time. Like, there's no time limit. Take your time, get yourself comfortable, get all your articles and your books all set up beforehand, right? Review your materials, check the Wikipedia pages for when these people born, died, and all that, and who they were students of, and then take your test, right? Once you're ready. There's no reason to be unprepared. And if you don't get them by Friday, you can do by Saturday. That's fine. Just before, as long as it's before Monday. Yeah. Any questions about the test? And then on Friday, I'll have Jose put just a note on the door in case you forget that there's no class. If it is open, you're welcome to, sit in here and take your test, or you can go to the library or UTC or wherever. Does everybody have a computer that works and you can take the test? Cool. Good. If you don't, just email me. We'll figure something out. Library's got computers you can use, and you can check them out. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Marvin Harris. There he is. What year were you all born? Anybody born before 2001? Oh yeah, you were alive when Marvin Harris was alive. That's good. We finally have reached this point, right? Marvin Harris died in 2001. I remember I was in junior in college is an anthropology major. And he was at UF when he died, and I was at UCF, right? So it was right down the road. Man, that was like the first real one. But Oh man, they just keep coming recently. All my anthropological heroes are all gone. But you know, it's because they were born in the 20s before. Yeah, so Marvin Harris, let's talk about him. And we read I don't know, it's probably one of the most read anthropology articles of the second half of the 20th century. You know, this Sacred Cattle, it was reproduced here. This is originally from 1966, but reproduced in 92 in Cultural Anthropology. And then, you know, within the book, I think Campbell's and King's, and it's widely reproduced. And probably, if not like his most, you know, everything, it really encapsulates kind of his ideas in a very straightforward way, which I think is good for like undergrads to get, right? So we're going to talk about him today. Let's see, Marvin Harris, there he is. Well, here's my blank papers. Let's do this real. Marvin Harris. All right, here we go. Marvin Harris, born 1926 in Brooklyn, New York. Died 2001 in Gainesville, Florida. Marvin. And in many ways, this will only make sense kind of in a couple weeks when we get up to the other side of the controversy or the controversy. These different paradigms. Right? Marvin Harris is really one half of what I would consider the great debate in late 20th century anthropology about how to study culture, right? Are we studying it from a materialist perspective, or are we studying it from a cultural symbolic perspective, right? Marvin Harris being kind of the public champion of this position, Clifford Geertz, who we'll talk about in a couple weeks, being kind of the public face of the other. And really, right, they were both kind of intellectual giants, right? You know, I give a shout out to both of them in my thesis and, you know, for my master's thesis, try to combine these two, you know, the material and the symbolic perspectives. But really, this is kind of the great debate. So it's important to talk about, right? He's born in 27, right at the beginning, you know, about 2 years or so right before the Great Depression. Most of his childhood is spent in poverty in New York. But like many of his generation, you know, he was by his late, you know, by 1940s or so, World War II rolls around, and he is, you know, just old enough to enlist kind of by the end of the war, joins the army, finishes his service, gets a GI Bill, and this is actually, there's a whole bunch of kind of mid-century anthropologists, and especially a lot of the guys that, especially men, who are my professors, you know, in the 90s, right? We're this generation who went to World War II, got the GI Bill, right? Started out as kind of, you know, prior to World War II, anthropology and academics kind of more generally were really restricted to like a certain class of people, right? Even today, my parents are, what are you going to do with anthropology, right? It was like, that's for rich people who don't have to worry about like practical matters. You can just go off to Papua New Guinea and live in the rainforest for a little bit, right? But after World War II, the GI Bill happened. What is the GI Bill? This is a good history question. You may know. Gave soldiers what? Yeah, you go to college, right? As a thank you, kind of for, and it's not all servicemen, right? That there's the kind of racial history of who got to get it, right? Of course, white people get to primarily got the benefits, and many African Americans were excluded. But for many servicemen, right, the GI Bill was a real amazing opportunity, especially after fighting in the Pacific or in Europe, to kind of like go to college, right? And for a group of people who basically never expected to go to college, either because they were too poor in the Depression or they thought they were going to get killed by Nazis in World War II. But, you know, going to college is pretty awesome after all of that. And there's this whole generation, mid 20th century anthropologists who kind of come out of that post-war experience, and a lot of studies of different parts of the world, especially because, you know, people were posted in different parts of the world. So like my professor was super interested in the Pacific because he got posted in, you know, the Pacific Islands. So wanted to learn about the cultures, right? Marvin Harris goes to Columbia, which you probably remember. Who was at Columbia? What's Columbia University famous for? The first what? Yeah, Boaz, first Department of Anthropology in America. That's where he goes. Boaz is gone by this point, right? He died in 42, but it wasn't that long after, right? It's within like 10 years of Boaz's death. And he starts out as a Boazian, as we all did back in the day. Because Boaz was just this intellectual giant, and because Boaz trained all the other professors of anthropology that there were at the time, right? So everybody was a Boazian. But like Leslie White, right, pretty soon he started to become interested in materialism and rejecting kind of the Boazian cultural relativism, historical particularism as being kind of unweighty or intellectually not very rigorous, right? It wasn't very sciencey. And just like Leslie White, he was all into the science. He did his field work in 1957, his first field work in Mozambique in Africa. He also did field work in Brazil. Usually I tell you where they did field work because I think it's kind of cool to see where they come from, but it is important for our discussion today. What was our article about today? Where was it about? India. Did Marvin Harris do field work in India? No, and he says so in the first paragraph, right? We'll talk about maybe why that might be an issue, right? But keep that in mind, right? So he did his field work. He got a job at Columbia, which is always the sweet gig, right? If you go to grad school, they give you a job there. They must really like you. Not all of us had that opportunity. I wish I was at UVA, but they didn't offer that to me. But he would stay there until 1981, where he moved to UF, and he stayed there until he died in 2001. I never got to meet him when he was still alive, because I was still an undergrad, and we were all kind of wowed by him. And he was basically he died in 2001, but there was kind of this period of decline at the end where, he was not really teaching very much, and he was basically by 2000 was in an old folks home, not, suffering from dementia and things like that. So I never did get to meet him, but he was definitely an influential figure and was still kind of around as I was starting my college career in anthropology, which is kind of neat. In 19, he started to publish, right? Like I said, he started out as kind of a Boazian under Charles Wagley. But really by 1968, right, so about 10 years after his initial field work, he wrote his first book called, or his first really important book called Rise of Anthropological Theory, or what his graduate students affectionately nicknamed Rat. Which is kind of funny to me, in which he lays out a new paradigm, right? This is really influenced by people like Leslie White, Julian Stewart, but also some of these really old school 19th century, thinkers like Thomas Malthus and Darwin and things like that. Talking and writing at the same time. Materialism. And that's kind of the paradigm he is most associated with, and we're going to talk about today, cultural materialism, right? Again, inspired by especially Leslie White, who we talked about on Monday, with his unilineal evolution, and Julian Stewart, who at the same time had a similar theory called multilineal evolution, which said cultures evolve, but they evolve differently, like hunting and gathering people in the Arctic are going to evolve differently than hunting and gathering people in the desert or in the grasslands or things like that, right? So, but inspired by these kind of 1950s neo-evolutionist or evolutionary revival kind of scholars, right? Stolen away from Boaz to the hot new thing, which again, it was kind of the hot new thing in the 50s, right? This return to materialism. And it was also largely influenced kind of further back, largely, by Marx, just like White, Marx's perspective, as well as Thomas Malthus. Anybody know what Malthus is famous for, his theories? Like 19th century guy. He's the overpopulation guy, right? We're getting too many people and it's creating population pressure in England, and how are we going to deal with all this stuff, right? in many ways, the worst of Malthus is, comes out in Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Let the poor go off and die. So we can get rid of the surplus population, right? That's kind of like the worst interpretation of Malthus, but it's the one that we think of often because, every Christmas we watch Michael Caine Muppets talk about over surplus population, right? So yeah. So just like Leslie White, he wanted anthropology to be a science. Like I said last time, most of us anthropologists have this chip on our shoulder that they don't consider us a science. And so there's a lot of work, especially during this time, to be sciencey, right? He says, I want to apply science to understand the similarities and differences between cultures, right? We do this from a scientific perspective. He says that in general, I want to look at two things, right? We talked about this last time, this concept of emic versus edict. What's the difference? You might remember. Emic versus edict. This is in your text, actually. Yeah, the insider versus the outsider, and which is which. Yeah, emic is insider, emic inside, edict outside, right? And he says that what we're interested, well, actually, what do you think, based on your reading, which one is Marvin Harris more interested in? Try the other one. The outside, right? And that's basically what he's doing in the Powell article, right? He's taking the outsider perspective. And we'll talk about this. I want to actually go through this article a little bit. I really like this one. And we'll talk about the outsider perspective. But he says, yeah, it's the outsider perspective, right? That's what we're really interesting, that often when people say one thing, and people can say a lot of different things, and that's all interesting to us as anthropologists. But what we really want to pay attention to is what people are actually doing, right? Because people can say things, but actually do the opposite. And this is a problem we have in field work all the time, right? I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, something that Jose and I always laugh at. My people always say that. But do not go over there because that place is haunted, right? But you said don't go over there. Why? You don't believe in it. But well, which is more important, right? Is it the saying that you don't believe in it, or not going over to those ruins because they're definitely haunted by ancient ghost Maya, right? And Harris is like, yeah, it's what people are actually doing. Harris is a Marxist, and in many ways similar to what we talked about with Leslie White. This idea of superstructure, the cake model of society, structure and infrastructure. Y'all remember this from Marvin Harris or from Leslie White? See if I can draw a cake. There's a nice cake. A layer cake, right? Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. Place. Where's our cake? Yeah, cake. The society as a cake model, which I think is always kind of fun, right? You'll remember. And it's a layer cake, and superstructure is on top. Superstructure being the things that we consider like culture with a capital C, right? Like values, morals, ideology, religion, myth, sayings and aphorisms, models of behavior and how you're supposed to raise your kids, all those kind of like culture, right? Yeah. Superstition, all that, like belief. Anything is belief, right? In stuff that lives in your head, right? Anything that lives in your head pretty much is in superstructure. Structure is social organization. How is your society organized? Are you a class society? Are you a band? Are you a tribe? Are you a chiefdom? Are you a state? Are you matrilineal society? Are you patrilineal society? Do you have clans? Do you have moieties? How does society organize? Freight trees, you have one group of society live over here on this side of town, and the other part of society lives on this side of town. Like, how is society organized, right? The structure. And then the infrastructure is technology, it's population, and it's often environmental kind of stuff, right? This is very similar again to White and Rappaport. Which do you think that Marvin Harris emphasizes? Which layer of cake is he emphasizing? Layer of cake. He says this throughout. Huh? No, that would be Geertz and his crew. We'll come back to them. What's the opposite of that? The infrastructure. Yeah, the infrastructure, right? He's a Marxist. He says that he has this great quote, about why, as anthropologists, like, he says, yeah, yes, superstructure is like cool and that's interesting and all that, but like as a science, we're trying to figure these things. We're trying to figure out how societies grow, right? And he says, to endow the mental superstructures, the ideas and ideologies, with strategic priority, as these cultural idealists advocate, it's a bad bet, right? Nature is indifferent to whether God is a loving father or a bloodthirsty cannibal, right? It doesn't really matter in how you relate to your environment. This is very similar to the Rappaport kind of stuff. But nature is not indifferent to whether the fallow period in a Swidden or slash and burn field is 1 year or 10, right? These have real world impacts, while this, ideology is kind of, it's decoration, or it changes things, but it's not the overriding thing, right? So he says, we know the powerful restraints exist on the infrastructural level. Hence, it is a good bet that these restraints are passed on to the structure and superstructural components. And this is what he's doing in this article, right? Let's talk about cultural ecology. We talked about cultural ecology with Roy Rappaport. What's cultural ecology all about? Can we remember? Yeah, do your culture and how your culture impacts that environment, right? That kind of relationship between culture and environment, which again, I think is really like, this is 1966. This article comes out. Think of what's going on in 1966, right? This is really the birth of the hippie movement is happening like that year, right? In Grateful Dead. And, we're 3 years out from Woodstock. We're 5 years out from the Crying Indian commercials. So this is really like at that kind of tipping point. And you can really see a difference between some of the 60s and 70s stuff and maybe what you get from people like Leslie White, who are writing more in the 50s, right? And sorry, I'm fix my camera here. He starts off with a kind of proposition, right, in this article. He says that for a long time, people, experts say, have said that there are too many cows in India, right? The cows there's too many, and they are a drain on resource. And he just has like quotes, right? Like, these are irrational ideologies. To overlook foods that are abundantly local and are of high nutritional value, to utilize other scarce foods of less value, right? Because he's writing at a time when it's like the mid-century, and there's a lot of modernizing going on in India, and people outside experts at like USAID and other NGOs were like, hey, you guys have all these cows just kind of walking around, not doing anything. Why don't you eat them, right? You have all these hungry people and you have all these cows, like, and they say, no, we have this religious belief that we shouldn't do this. Ahisma is the number 2. Hindu principle of the unity of life, which sacredness of cattle is the principal subcase and symbol, right? So this idea that cows are sacred, right? And you've probably heard of the sacred cows of India. Again, he talks about like just all these people, citing many sources, saying basically how irrational it is from the expert perspective to keep these, right? The Indian Ministry of Information says the large animal population is more of a liability than an asset in our view of land resources, right? The Knight says, because of Hindu religion, there exists a large number of cattle whose utility to the community did not justify economically the fodder which they consumed, right? And White really tries to go against this, right? He makes the case, he tries to make the case in this article that these systems, which from the outside seem irrational or seem detrimental to society, are actually adaptations to that environment, right? In a very cultural ecology kind of way. And he's really pushing back at this time, right? There's this idea of like, it's racist in some ways, Oriental mysticism, right? That we Protestants, who are primarily, in the West running America and things like that, in Western Europe and England and places like this, we are rational and we use the world rationally. And those people over in India and China and Papua New Guinea or wherever, they're all mystified by their religious beliefs and superstitions. And that's really what's keeping them out of the modern worlds, right? It's why Western Europe was the one to invent the steam engine and the airplane and all that kind of stuff, while everybody else is, mired in this kind of past, unable to leave the past behind, right? And he says that no, I think it's really interesting because Harris gets kind of a bad rap, but he's really being a good Boasian here, being like, no, that's just your ethnocentrism here, right? That's your ethnocentrism talking because you don't really understand what's going on. And so he says, instead of being maybe detrimental, these cows, which you just see wandering around and maybe don't recognize as particularly useful, actually have a lot of uses in these societies, right? They're used for milk production, they're used for traction, or used as like to pull plows. Their dung is used for making fires. Old cows get sold for beef, and their hides gets used, right? They are often kind of, this legislation often has very political and social reasons, not just kind of religious reasons as well. And he goes through all these different things, right? And similar to kind of what we saw in Roy Rappaport, because it is science, he loves numbers, right? Well, we can compare the milk production in India to the United States. It's 413 pounds per cow in India versus 5,000 pounds in the US, right? So it seems inefficient, right? They're like less than a tenth of the milk production that we have in the US. But he says that, again, this is not why they're there, right? They're not kept for maybe their milk production. They are used for other things. And primarily, he says they are used for traction, right? This is a society at the time, primarily smallholding farmers who do not have gas-powered tractors, right? And again, if you think of like the 1960s America, we're seeing the consolidation of kind of family farms into bigger farms. By like the 1960s in America, pretty much nobody's using a mule or a cow to like plow your fields. But in India, this is still primarily the way that that happens, right? And he says that this is super important. While 80% of people's calories comes from grain, if you don't have a tractor, you basically can't do this without a cow, right? So this is, he says, the reason that cows are kept, or bullocks especially are kept, are to use to pull plows, right? And he says that while there seems to be a lot of cows in India, if you do the ratio of farmers to cows or to oxen, it's actually not that much. He says, ideally you should have 2 oxen to pull your plow, and then it averages out to like 1.5 oxen per farmer, when you look at the country. And so there's kind of a low ratio of animals to people, even though we kind of think, wow, there's sure a lot of waste, useless cows wandering around there. One of the things that I think is really interesting about Marvin Harris, he gets a bad rap, and we'll talk about that for a lot of reasons. One of the things that I do think is really interesting that you see Harris and people, other materialists who are coming out of like second wave materialism, the Eric Wolfs, the Marshall Salins of the world, the Marvin Harris of the world, right? Is their emphasis on history. Unlike structural functionalists who kind of see society as like a watch or an organism that's kind of steady state and maintains itself, he's actually looking at kind of how British colonialism and then later the anti-colonialist movement of Gandhi really affected these kind of both material practices as well as spiritual beliefs, right? He says that the reason that there's so many farmers, these small farmers in India, is directly related to British land tenure systems, right? The British came in and changed land tenure systems, and now there's lots of these very small family farms, and they each need a cow. So that's really interesting. On one hand, he's tying the political, what actually became known as, this is different from cultural ecology. What do you think this is? Political ecology. Not a trick. And how politics impacts the environment, right? Not just culture, but politics. And we can think about this in our society, right? How do tax breaks for electric cars determine the number of electric cars sold this year, which in turn determines CO2 pollution, right? These are political decisions. How do political decisions about land use in Florida, where I'm from, change the environment, right? When one governor comes in and says you can bulldoze those cypress dome swamps to put neighborhoods in, how does that affect water quality downstream versus another governor who says you should protect these things, right? So saying that politics and like history are super important for understanding the environment. But on the other hand, we need to understand the ecology, right? So while the British did create this system of small independent farms with land tenure reform, the ecology and the weather and the climate of India have a big to do as well, right? This is a monsoon tropical environment. And he says that for these small farmers, you need to plant within a few days after the start of the rains, right? There's a very small window in when you can plant. And if you miss that window, probably there's a high chance of your plants getting caught in drought because they're going to not finish in time before the dry season comes, and you're all going to starve. So with those two things put together, the politics of British colonialism and land reform, and the ecology of India and the monsoon seasons and the climate and the types of crops that they grow, there creates a situation in which having lots of cows, especially bulls around, makes sense because you need two bulls to pull your plow at a very certain time of year. You only have a 1 week window to plow your field and plant your crops. And if you don't have cows, you got to borrow them from your neighbor, but your neighbor is planting at the exact same time and is using his cows, and he probably doesn't have it. So you got to go to the big boss man, who like the big landowner guy who has lots of cows, and you got to pay a lot of money to use his cows, and he often charges you like super high interest, like 200% what you should be paying. And people go into debt. And if you go into debt, then the landowner gets to keep your land and you lose your land. You have to go live in the city slums, right? So it becomes a form of insurance or risk to have these cows around, even though they seem like they're not super useful to outsiders, because they allow people to plow and not lose their lands. He also says that there are other features as well. Probably the other one, one of the other ones he uses is pasture, right? He says that in the US, the way we treat our cows is different from the way they treat their cows in India. Right? Even in the 1960s, people in the US, if you're a dairy farmer, you're gonna treat your cows, you're gonna feed them pretty well. You're gonna fatten them up with grain. And we still do this. If you drive out, there's a really big difference between the cows that live between here and Clovis and the cows that live between here and Roswell. You've driven down there, right? Those are pasture cows versus, like a dairy cow over here and between Clovis are fed grain. And he says that while in America, especially most high producing dairy cows are fed grain, in India, they are not, right? In India, they are eating trash pretty much. They're eating stuff that grows on the side of the road. They're eating corn cobs or rice husks. They're eating, grain stems. They're eating just, whatever is left over. There's a few like edges of fields they eat, but basically the cows in India don't compete for grain, don't compete with humans for grain in the same way they do in the US. Like in the US, eating beef is super inefficient in the US, right? It takes like 8 times the amount of calories. You can get 8 times more calories or more from a unit of land for grain versus if you were raising cattle. Cattle and beef production especially is super inefficient in terms of calories and per land acre, right? And he says that, but because they don't actually compete, that it works, right, in this system, because it's allowing people in a very Leslie White kind of way to get more energy out of their environment. You're not actually spending any more resources on these animals, but you're getting to use them as free tractors, right? And we would be paying for gas and all that stuff for it. He says they also have other benefits, and it's probably the biggest one is their poop. Why is cow poop important? It's kind of a funny thing to say. What do they do with cow poop? They can work as fertilizer, right? He says that, again, in the US in the 1960s, this is post-World War II and the boom of artificial petrochemical fertilizers, right? You just spend money, you go to the fertilizer store, you put all this stuff in the ground, which is probably not really that great for the environment, right? But the cows poop in the farm or in the fields, and that serves as a fertilizer. So people are able to get 2 or 3 crops a year out of the same land, and it doesn't really decrease soil fertility. You don't have to do like slash and burn agriculture like they do in Maya regions, because you got these cows walking around dropping poop everywhere. What else can you do with cow poop? That's pretty crazy. What can you do with cow poop? Yeah, it's cooking fuel, right? And in many ways, he says, again, just like how we have substituted human or animal power for our tractors using gas-powered tractors, we often use coal or oil or natural gas to heat our houses. But if you're in India and you don't have that, cow poop is, a great way of heating your home or cooking your food. Somewhere between, he says that the BTU, this is 1922, he's quoting somebody, the thermal equivalent, the dung used to heat a house or to cook with, is equivalent to 35 million tons of coal or 68 million tons of wood, right? And he says that these people who see cows in India as inefficient really aren't paying attention to the whole story, right? You're not taking into account the ways that people actually use this. And if you didn't have these cows walking around pooping everywhere, you'd be deforesting your hillsides because you'd need an extra every year, 70 million tons of wood. So, right, it's an adaptation to this environment. Pasture. One of the other things I think is really interesting is he does talk about culture and these kind of religious laws with this, the anti-slaughter legislation. Yeah, anti-slaughter legislation, these old age houses for cows. And what I think is really interesting here is, again, he turns to history and he says that, yeah, this is a spiritual belief and it does have these cultural roots. But the reason it's so emphasized is because of Gandhi. Why was Gandhi so keen on emphasizing the sacred nature of cows? It's because Gandhi was just like a real spiritual dude. Marvin Harris says no, right? A cultural idealist or somebody who's interested in symbolism or ritual would say, yeah, maybe he is, right? But for Marvin Harris, there's always some kind of material or political explanation kind of lurking beneath the surface. Why was Gandhi so into protecting cows? Give you hints, because other people didn't like it. Who was eating cows at the time? The Muslims and the British. Right? British were cow eaters, right? That's like the slur. Muslims too, you're just eating cows, right? And so Gandhi pushed these kind of legislations, Harris argues, to as part of the independence movement, right? To get people riled up in anti-British sentiment, into anti-Muslim sentiment, to create this identity of Hinduism, right? Or Hindu India as separate from British or separate from, what would become Pakistan and Bangladeshi Muslim areas, right? That the ideology or the religious belief serves this kind of political function, and it serves a very historical political function, right? It comes about at a certain time in history because of the anti-colonial sentiment of the 1940s and 50s, right? So super interesting stuff. Let's see, we got a few minutes left. How much do I have? Yeah.
Can I go backwards?
Definitely.
Do you think his argument on pastures would still stand now that we have like Milo specifically created to feed cows and horses?
Milo?
Okay, so it's like some type called sorghum seed. I grew
Oh,
up with
yeah, sorghum, yeah.
Yeah. And so now that like Milo has like been created to feed cows and horses, and so there's not a competitiveness between humans and cows for Milo, this argument you think still stands?
Probably. It depends on how it's grown. If it's grown like without water, you know, you can make the argument that that stuff takes water, right? And we're competing against, you got to grow this stuff, and that could be used for food crops or something like that. Versus like what he's talking about is really like these things are eating trash or eating like grass on the side of the road. So it really depends on the production of Milo, right? I'm not an ag person, I don't know. But you could tell me. Do you use water to grow it, or does it grow just from the sky?
No, Milo is dry land.
Yeah.
And so there's not like a sprinkler system or anything put on it. It's just whatever.
Yeah. And Harris actually makes the point that these cultural and historical conditions can change, right? And that you know, he even makes this in kind of the rejoinder at the end. You get this really interesting thing that people like offering their criticism and coming back and saying that like, yeah, this is really historically bound, right? That this is not just some kind of universalist, structural, functionalist explanation, but based on the sources that I read, again, this is kind of problematic because he's only reading sources from the 20s through the 50s, that at this time period, this system makes sense, right? Things have changed, and he kind of acknowledges it. Like in the post-independence era, things are a little differently. And probably before 1800, before the British really roll in and change society, it's going to be different. But in this time period, this system kind of works, right? And that's one of the critiques. I can't remember which one it was. Who was it who makes that critique? Who says that, Sutler, I'm trying to remember which of the critiques it was. It says that, yeah, things are different now. You know, people used to poop in the field, and then that was fertilizer. But now there's government, you know, agents and NGOs that say who are building latrines, right? And that's changing the way that crops are fertilized, right? Or that kind of similarly, that maybe this information's out of date, and you know, if you had done field work there now, you'd have a more complex understanding of what's going on currently, right? But yeah, and that's basically kind of the general focus of Harris's argument, is that these things which seem irrational to us as Westerners, right, often make sense within a particular ecological, political circumstance, right? That these are adaptations in a certain kind of way. How much time do we have? 5 minutes or so. Marvin Harris, let's see what else we want to talk about this. And he has often, you know, calls himself infrastructural determinism, right? That the infrastructure determines it. But he says probably more likely is probability, right? Because it's not deterministic. This is again trying to be science. That it's not every monsoon environment that has, you know, plow agriculture is going to have this belief about the sacredness of their animals, but you know, probably, you know, of the 75% confidence rating, right? We can say that it's probably going to, these, you know, religious or belief are going to emerge from a certain structure, right, or infrastructural system. And this becomes his kind of jam throughout the rest of his life, and it becomes super popular. Again, he's like the kind of person, he wrote 17 major books over the course of his life, including 2 anthropology textbooks. And he was really one of these authors that aimed for when your dad is going on an airplane and he goes to the bookstore and he's like trying to decide between like a Tom Clancy book or something like that. There's always these like, there's this kind of genre of history or anthropology books like the 1491 or like the Jared Diamond kind of stuff, you know, like Collapse or Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's like aimed at a popular audience. And that was like Marvin Harris's niche. Like he was, you know, aimed at the educated public who was like interested in anthropology kind of, or like world history, or like you know, had ideas of, who knew about sacred cows in India or cannibals and, you know, as ancient Aztec or the Yanomami, but like didn't really like study anthropology, but was still interested, right? And he wrote a bunch of books kind of talking about it. Probably the most famous of these is Cannibals and Kings. That's really like the bestseller. Cannibals and Kings, there it is. 1977, picture. Cannibals and Kings, the origins of culture. Again, this is one of these kind of big, high level-y kind of theory books, like, but for a popular culture, right? I'm going to show you this book, and it's going to be one of the most informative and exciting cultural studies, right? It's going to teach you about like why the world is the way it is, right? Why life is how it is, and why ancient societies developed this way, right? And again, just very similar to Roy Rappaport, this kind of mid 20th century obsession with protein and how much protein people are getting, and how, you know, the change in environment changes society. So for instance, he talks about, one of the early chapters in here talks about the transition from hunting and gathering societies to agricultural societies. And if you remember back to, you've all probably taken 310, that hunting and gathering societies tend to not have very many kids, right? 3 or 4 kids, versus the early agricultural societies are having like 8 or 9 kids, right? He says that it's a function of the infrastructural shift, right? As people switch from a low carb diet as hunter and gatherers to a high carb diet as early ag people, it changes women's fertility. They start to have more kids. There's less spacing between kids. Women can have kids closer together because they're not malnourished. It leads to more children, which leads to larger population, which leads to civilization, right? You also have ones in here like, why do Jews not eat pork? Right? It's taboo in Jewish culture to eat pork. And, you know, for someone with a more ideological or symbolic understanding, like, well, yeah, it's in the culture, right? Mary Douglas, we're going to read in 2 weeks, right? Says Jews don't eat pork because their neighbors do, right? Not because of any ecological reason, but because it sets them apart from other people, right? And he says, no, this is not the reason. They may tell you that's the reason. You know, that's the Enoch reason, is that, you know, God told us this, or, you know, those weirdo Moabites don't do this, or the Egyptians eat pork and so we don't. But Marvin Harris says the real reason behind, right, behind the curtain, is that unlike some of these other animals like cows, which can just eat, you know, stuff that people aren't eating, pigs tend to compete with humans for food in these societies, especially in a very desert-like environment of the Near East. And that while cows produce secondary products like milk, pigs don't do that. So there's a taboo against eating. Right? Does a similar thing with irrigation, right? He says that, well, irrigation in, you know, in China and India is often done by large state-level societies because it's on rivers, but in Europe, a lot of farming is done due to rainfall, and so you don't have these kind of central control, and it's why the lords in the Middle Ages weren't able to stop the rise of towns and things like that. He keeps going on. Aztecs were cannibals because there's protein deficiency in that society. He actually has one later on, one of his later books, Why Nothing Works, when he applies these principles to modern American life, to inflation, to why women are joining the workforce in larger numbers, why marital stability is going down in the US, and why all our products are kind of shitty today, right? So he applies this cultural materialist perspective kind of broadly. We're almost done with time, actually. We are over time. But what do you think are some of the critiques of this? So what we end on. Why? There are some holes in it. I mean, it seems very sciencey, and that's what he was going for. But what's maybe some problems with adopting a strict cultural materialist perspective? Why what? Yeah, all right, maybe why they do different things. Why else do you think? Yeah. That's right. There's a whole lot of this, like, by disregarding the emic, you do a lot of this, like, the people say this, but what's really going on, and I, as a white American man, will tell you what's really going on, right? These people are, you kind of recreate this Oriental mysticism that he's trying to actually go against, right? That you're saying that the people, they say that it's religion, but it's really about like dung and how much BTUs of heating you can create and all this stuff, right? And it does disregard, I think, a lot of what we consider really important in cultural anthropology, right? Like how values and ideologies and beliefs actually kind of determine what we do in many ways, right? And so we're going to take the test next week, and then after that, we'll have a couple weeks of kind of the anti-materialist, right? We're going to look at structural anthropology and symbolic anthropology, two schools of thought, which really go in the opposite direction and say that while like the material stuff is important and all, what's really important is the symbol, the ritual, and the structural relationship between these things. And then everything else, is kind of built on top of that. So instead of going from layer cake bottom up, going from the top. So we'll talk about that in the second part of the class after test number 1. So that's it for today. I posted the review sheet. Test is up. You're welcome to take it whenever you want.